Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon on a warm Friday afternoon when you might want to be doing other things. I'm going to start this presentation with a few words of introduction, and then I'm going to turn it over to the students. My name is Sydney Van Morgan. I'm the International Studies Program Director and a Senior Lecturer at Johns Hopkins University, and I'm really excited for you to hear about the research that my students have conducted on this topic. This project got going a couple of years ago when I started investigating the life of the founder of this university with three other research partners, both at and outside the university. Johns Hopkins, as you may know, was a Quaker. He was born in 1795, about 30 miles south of the Homewood campus on a tobacco plantation in central Anne Arundel County. Like most Quaker families in the Western Chesapeake during the 18th century, the Hopkins family owned enslaved people. But in 1777, the Baltimore Yearly Meeting of the Religious Society of Friends, that's the body that oversaw all Quaker congregations on the Western Shore, issued a decree that Quakers had to manumit their enslaved people or leave the religion. Now, manumission, for those of you who may not know, is the act or the process of freeing an enslaved person from bondage. It could take many forms, as our research demonstrates, and as you're going to hear about today, but that's the basic concept. It's the act or the process of freeing an enslaved person from bondage. Johns Hopkins' direct ancestors followed this decree from the yearly meeting in 1778. The grandfather of our founder, Johns Hopkins Sr., filed a deed in Anne Arundel County Court manumitting 42 enslaved people, some immediately and some after further terms of service. Other members of the Hopkins family filed similar deeds, and some, and this is important, members of the Hopkins family defied the Quaker testimony against slavery. They kept their slaves and they left the Society of Friends. So we started this project really narrowly looking at the Hopkins family, and Hardy Williams, one of the student presenters, has been working with me on this from the very beginning, 2 years and going now. But it soon became clear that we needed to know more about private manumission in general in Maryland in order to understand a few basic empirical questions. How did manumission function in the state? What were the relevant laws? How common was manumission, and what was its geographic distribution across the state? How many manumitters were Quaker versus non-Quaker? But the problem that we discovered was that this data had not been gathered before. So at this point, Lydia and Ching Shi joined the project along with another student, Bailey Pasternak, who wasn't able to join us today. And together, we as a team have been combing through the extant archival collections at the Maryland State Archives to attempt to gather all manumission deeds filed with county courts between 1775 and 1785. And I'll tell you why those years are the years in a minute. We're not done. These are preliminary results, but we hope that others will find this information helpful. One important point about manumission that I want to emphasize before we get into this is that manumission was rare. It was less rare in Maryland than in many other states in the United States, but it was still uncommon, especially during the 18th century, which is the period that we are looking at. So, for example, in 1790, in the area that we're going to be talking about today, there were about 30,000 enslaved inhabitants held in bondage to families like the Hopkins family. So far, we've collected the names of 527 individuals who were manumitted in these areas, but that represents less than 2% of the total enslaved population at the time. So it was rare, but still, private manumission was an important pathway to freedom for African Americans in 18th century Maryland, along with freedom suits, self-purchase, and flight. And it's really important to understand how it worked, and particularly in the context of the Quaker movement critique of slavery that kind of reached its pinnacle in 1777 with the decree that all Quaker families had to quit slavery. So with this, do you want to show the first slide, Hardy? Okay, so this is just some really basic information about the data that we have collected. We have, in the 4 counties that we have looked at, we have collected a total of 69 individual deeds. that were filed in county courts in 4 counties: Anne Arundel County, Prince George's County, Harford County, and Montgomery County. Why these counties? First of all, we knew that there were Quaker communities in these particular counties. Second, these counties all had relatively good records that we could mine to try to answer our questions. So it was very intentional. And I think it's important to point out that that means that our results aren't necessarily representative of the whole state, but just of the counties that we have looked at. Of these, within these 69 deeds, we have discovered 527 individual names. They are part of a data set that we have created and that we're growing with our additional research. It's also posted on a blog that I have called houseofhopkins.com. You can see everything there, all the data. We've also posted all of the manumission deeds if you're interested in looking at them specifically on another site. So that's the breakdown. Again, manumission could take many forms, and it's important to emphasize that the majority of manumissions were not immediate, they were gradual. So one of the most important things that we looked at when we collected the data from all of these documents was it immediate or delayed? And we found about 61% were delayed. Individuals were guaranteed freedom in the future. So it was promised but delayed. And about 39% were given freedom immediately. And that has something to do with the laws that structured manumission in Maryland. It also has to do with the way that the Quakers approached manumission. We also, of course, wanted to look at how many of our manumissions were from Quakers versus non-Quakers. This was a tricky stat to pin down because we don't know. There's nothing about many of these deeds that says this was a Quaker. So we had to find additional information, including from, for example, Quaker records that allowed us to know that that person actually was a member of the Society of Friends. But based on that, we have about 58% of our deeds about 58% of the individuals manumitted were manumitted by Quaker families. The largest deed that Qingxi is going to talk about in a few minutes was filed by Sam Snowden from Prince George's County in 1780. And the largest number of manumissions by any family was by the Hopkins family that manumitted 88 enslaved people across 3 or 4 different deeds in Anne Arundel County. Okay, next slide. These next 2 slides are just really presenting sort of graphically the information that we collected. These are individual manumissions by year. It shows what we expected to find, which is that the manumissions really take off after 1778, and that reflects the importance of Quakers in these particular counties and the fact that the majority of our deeds were filed by Quaker families. Next slide. And similarly, if we look at the deeds, not the individuals, we somewhat of a similar pattern, a little bit more similar across the years in terms of when the deeds were filed. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Hardy Williams. Take it away.
Well, hello. My name is Hardy. I am a senior at Johns Hopkins. I study public health and international relations. Like Professor Van Morgan just said, I've been helping work on this project for about 2 years now. It's really taught me a lot, and I'm hoping that I can kind of go into the methodology that we kind of used just starting out to learn how to use the land records. And then I can go into what was powerful to me about this project, and we can start seeing from Lydia and Qingxi what we use this research to, how we understand people's lives using it. So a lot of our research came with the generous help of the Maryland State Archives and people working there. They've been very, very helpful in teaching us how to use their records correctly, and it's something that can be very difficult. This is especially considering the fact that in Maryland and in many other states, the process of of bringing records into digital domains, and digitizing records is not complete. It's very slow. Some records in some counties have been entirely destroyed in fires 100 years ago. Other records still exist, but only exist physically as a paper copy somewhere. So our research took a lot of different methods. But we usually would start using the Maryland State Archives Guide to Government Records, and we would kind of bring that down to land records. They have many things there, though, concerning orphans court all the way down to judicial hearings. We would use those land records, and you'd see a huge table in yellow, kind of like what we see on the right here. They're all split up by date. For example, this county, I believe, is Anne Arundel. You can see going all the way back to 1662, and at the bottom you see down to 1795. You would see a record like that going all the way to the present almost, which is very interesting. And you can see under these book names initials. Those initials are actually court clerks who were recording what was going on in these books. When you had a land deed made, or you bought something for someone, or you freed a person, you would keep your document that you would free that person with or buy that thing with, and you would give the court clerk a copy. And it would be up to that court clerk to record all of these different deeds and all of these different subjects down into one book. And you can see the extent of their careers kind of in these kind of initial lines. For example, at the bottom, you see the letters NH, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That means this NH character, I believe he's Nicholas Hardwood, had a very long career. And it's kind of fun to engage with these individuals as you're doing this research. But let's say we wanted to take a book. We see use IB5. IB5 comes from the 1774 to 1778 period. So that would take us to an index, which is what we see on the far left here. This index is for the letter H. They obviously go A through Z. And you can read through these indexes to see the different types of documents encoded in this land record book. Here we see two different manumissions from the Hopkins family, one from Joseph Hopkins and one from Johns Hopkins the Elder. These are two of the people who Johns Hopkins, our founder, is descended from. One's a great uncle and one's the grandfather. So we would take these two manumissions. They say they're on pages 471 and it looks like 537. So we would enter that into the land records, and that would take us to the manumission, which we can see here in cursive on the right. This, as it says, is Johns Hopkins Sr., the elder. And we can see in green 5 enslaved people's names being listed here as being put up for manumission. We have basic information about these enslaved people, including their ages. Sometimes we can kind of group them together depending on how they're listed and build relationships, but we would encode them into this manumission spreadsheet below. So that we would put information in there, including the page number they were on, the difference between if the record was created and when the record was recorded, to give us some idea of the flow of the legal system. We would write down their first names. Sometimes they had last names. I like to get kind of implicit information, like when they would say they were about 5 years old versus being 5 years old. That gives me a bit of an indicator as to the relationship between the enslaver and the enslaved. So I like, or sometimes they know how many months old they are. That can be interesting. But yes, this is where our research really started, was just trying to encode these different names, and which we did on, I think earlier we said 69 different deeds and 527 individuals just in these initial counties. But this is what a lot of our research looked like in practice. It was a lot of cursive, and it can be really tough to read sometimes. And you'll find very quickly that cursive was not uniform. People had many different spellings, many different handwritings, many different words they used. And it's almost like picking up a new language. So I thought it would be fun kind of just to break for a second and take some time to just try and read this, because that's what we did kind of every day in here. And it can be tough. But in this document, we see words like about, which I would have written down. We see that we see their ages. We see the difference between the age they are now and the age which they were to be released. We would use that to write down the year that we would expect them to be released in, so that we can look for documents supporting that evidence. And you can go all the way down. We can see the date of the record here. But yeah, this is just vaguely kind of what our research would have looked like kind of day to day in terms of reading. This is one of my favorite cases that we got to discover. Something you learn very quickly about the land records is that they're very imperfect. Sometimes things are half filed, sometimes things are completely forgotten about. And in this case, something that was supposed to go not in the land records went into the land records, and that was a court proceeding. This was a case where a person named Anthony sued for his own freedom. It's something that isn't talked enough about in history books right now, but it's something that did happen across the colonial period, where enslaved people would use usually precedents in English law saying that they were not descended from an enslaved person, or that one of their descendants had stepped foot in England, to justify the fact that not only they, but perhaps the parents and their children had grounds to be freed. This case is actually fascinating because you notice it's against someone in the Hopkins family. It's a cousin of Johns Hopkins, I believe. And it's also interesting because it was the case was raised on behalf of the Maryland Society for Abolition, which was obviously an abolitionist society that was participated in by Gerard Hopkins, who was an uncle of Johns Hopkins and helped raise him. So this is almost an inter-family battle we see here between the participants of the Quakers kind of side who believe in manumitting their enslaved people, and the other side of the Hopkins family who these people are trying to leverage to make them and free their people. It can be very interesting, and we still haven't found the full effect of what actually happened to Anthony yet. These records are spread across land records, and we're not quite sure yet, but we're working hard and trying to find out what ended up happening to him. But with that, I think I wanted to round out my part on what's the most powerful part of this presentation for me, which goes into Anthony, and it's just learning about all of the stories of people and how 15 people living on the same plantation in 1785 could have had completely different backgrounds. And sometimes you can see that just in their names. You see names like Moses, Lighthouse, Caesar, Cupid, Aquila, Veronica, Robin, Charles. Sometimes they have last names. Sometimes their names have different backgrounds. And it very quickly paints a picture that these people are very interconnected to the world. They come from very different places with very, very different backgrounds. And it's really powerful to kind of to see that diversity and to recognize that this is sometimes the only time many of these people had their names written down formally. So a big part of our research has been able to take all of these records and encode them into publicly available domains, where otherwise they had not been like that before. They hadn't been things that people had been able to see. These people had been recorded on slave schedules as tick marks for past history. So this is a huge finding for us. But with that, I want to pass it off to Qingxi so we can talk about what we use this research to do.
Yep, thank you, Hardy. So what I'm going to first do is go through some of the legislations that set a really important groundwork for the time period we're observing. So the first law that I want to draw attention to is the 1752, an act to prevent disabled or superannuated slaves being set free or the manumission of slaves by any last will or testaments. So what this law mainly did is first, it made it illegal to liberate disabled or elderly slaves, which is 50 years or older. And secondly, it prohibited in most of the cases to free their slaves in their wills. So manumissions by property deeds, however, was permitted. So we can take a look at the legislation on the right side of the presentation. So this law explained two important findings that we constantly observe when we're looking at this time period. So first of all is that overwhelmingly freed slaves during our observed period from 1775 to 1785 are younger than 50. So this is a response to make sure that they are able to make money and support themselves in reaction to this law. And the second is that it explained why most of the manumissions that we observed were taking place by property deeds, because for most of the cases, it was illegal to free their slaves in their will. So the property deeds were where we focused to look at. So before this law in Maryland, there is not a explicit regulation so that the slave owners could actually grant slaves manumission through a verbal order or promise. And now this legislation made it explicit that this is not allowed anymore. So if we look at the deed here on the bottom left corner, it directly points out that the one being manumitted were capable of work and at quote unquote full liberty to deal with themselves. So this is in direct response to the legal requirement that anyone manumitted had to be able-bodied. Next page, please. And on this page is the 1790, the General Assembly voted to permit the manumission of slaves by last will and testament based on a petition submitted by Quakers. So it was until 1790, the 1750 law that we just talked about was repealed, and manumission are now allowed to take place by will. So if we look at the legislation on the left side of the presentation, we can see that this happened because it was based on a petition submitted by Quakers. So what this law did was that firstly, it not only allowed manumission by will, but it also punished masters who failed to provide adequate food and clothing and shelter to the slaves to be lawfully manumitted. So, but however, there are exceptions during the period and the deeds that we looked at. So one is that in Prince George's County, there are actually ones over 50 years of age manumitted during, looking at the land deeds that we observed, there are people over 50 years of age manumitted. And the second is that a couple deeds codified manumission made in wills and testaments, which was actually illegal at that time. So we can actually see a variation and nuances within these deeds during the times that we observed from the land record. Next page, please. So now I want to bring us to look at a specific case study, and the largest manumission that we actually found during the period that we observed is the non-agricultural slavery in Maryland from the deed of Samuel Snowden in 1780, who's also a Quaker. So in the early Maryland economy and identity were actually large based on slave-based agriculture. But here's a case where slaves were actually employed in non-agriculture industries, such as manufacturing iron. Next page, please. So here is a timeline of the Snowden family and their manumission of ironworks. So in 1790, the Maryland General Assembly passed an act for the encouragement of an iron manufacture within this province. And in 1730, Richard Snowden and family founded the Patuxent Ironworks in 1705 and beginning manufacturing in Prince George's County in 1730s. So the Snowden's ironwork employed a mixed workforce of indentured servants, convicts, and enslaved Africans. A great number of slaves were required to work the broad expanse of level land lying around the Patuxent River. And the family also exported the abundant crops such as tobacco and other products. And the navigable water, being near the Patuxent River actually gave them really great advantage. So we do not really know that the people manumitted in the deed were actually working the farm or the ironworks, but we highly suspect that due to such huge, ironworks doing here, that it is very likely that these people are actually from the Patuxent Ironworks. And in 1760, the Snowdens were Quaker, but between this period, they actually, put slaves into practice into the ironworks. And in 1780, Samuel Snowden, who is the son of Richard Snowden, he manumitted 35 adults and 36 children during this period, female at 18 and male at 21. And this is the biggest manumission deed that we can find during this period. And in 1802, Richard Snowden, who is Samuel Snowden's brother, he advertised $20 reward for a runaway slave named Isaac, and that may have worked in the ironworks. So what we are seeing here is actually a variation that while one brother is, manumitting people, and the other brother is actually, posting an ad on the newspaper to capture the runaway slaves. So we really see a sense of complexity and intricacy here that should not be generalized. And in 1847, the Snowden family owned the Patuxent Ironworks until this time, and Andrew and Elliot later on purchased the land from Snowden and made it into Muirkirk Furnace. And in 1860, it was bought by William E. Coffin, whose son renamed it the Muirkirk Ironworks. Next page, please. So here are some pictures from the Muirkirk Ironworks. But very unfortunately, we are unable to find, any pictures during the Patuxent Ironworks period, and because rarely the voices of the enslaved people are included. So we're trying to grasp a full picture of the working conditions and how's the life looking at for those enslaved ones during the Patuxent River when they were hired. And so now, in the first picture on the very left that we can see, this is the iron making process. And the picture below that is the 1872 Virginia ore bank. And in the middle is a very rare picture of Muirkirk African American workers in their uniform and shovels. And in the fourth picture is the building located behind these charcoal kilns where the African American workers and their families are housed. on the ground for the Muirkirk Ironworks. So we can see from these pictures that the conditions for the workers, both enslaved and free, were far from desirable. There are irritant dust and fumes and heat and danger of losing hand and legs, and the environment are just not that desirable to work in. So some workers later purchased the land around and built homes, which formed the now community called Rossville. But it is important to know that these pictures are not from the what the ironworks look like in the 1780s. It happened during the Muirkirk ironwork period, but it can give us a good sense of what might the environment look like during that time. And once again, this stresses the difficulty to accurately see and learn about the condition due to the lack of voices and pictures and information preserved from the that period and from the people that were enslaved. So just a very general about how these information about the Snowden family were gathered together. This required us looking at a lot of different sources from online and physically. We looked at census, we look at deed book. We actually get to look at the physical Snowden deed from the Maryland archive. And we were looking at a lot of other informations online and to see what it was preserved during this period of time. And next page, please. So now I'll hand it to Lydia.
Hi, so my name is Lydia and I joined the team when I was a sophomore. So since we believe that the comparison between the contents of Quaker manumission deed and non-Quaker manumission deed can provide us with a new insight into Quaker manumission, our presentation actually also includes non-Quaker manumission deeds. So I'm going to specifically talk about two stories documented in a non-Quaker manumission deed. The deed of William Cox, and the deed is from Harford County. Next page, please. So at that time, girls usually being freed at the age of 18, and boys usually being freed at the age of 21. But there are some exceptions. So this deed from Harford County shared two stories that provide explanations for the delay of manumission. However, it is important to be aware that the account provided in the deed is only the owner's version of the stories, but not necessarily the truth. So here is a clip of the story of Phoebe. Although Phoebe still continues in my family and has behaved much amiss in having two mulatto bastards, and is now with child with a third, and lately took her youngest child and left us in order to provide for herself, and was gone about 3 days, finding no person would take her in with her child in her condition, when she forced herself up on us again, much against our minds. So here, the owner complained about how Phoebe created a lot of trouble to his family. However, despite that the owner claimed that Phoebe forced herself on his family, he still decided to have her to keep serve in order to defray the expense Phoebe created. Next page, please. Here is the second story of Robin and Jacob. So the reason I have prolonged the time of Robin and Jacob beyond the age of 21 years and longer than the rest is on account the said Robin did kill with an axe a very valuable young mare, Harvey Wistful, and the said Jacob was an accomplice. They are therefore retained to serve the above-mentioned time as some compensation for the loss, unless their conduct should in future be such that by industry and more orderly deportment they prevail on me or my heirs to shorten their servitude. So from these two stories, we can discern that at that time they actually consider servitude as a punishment to the enslaved people who, from their view, are not behaving properly. Meanwhile, they are aware of the value of the enslaved people's labor force as they consider them to be able to compensate for their loss. Also, the very last sentence from the Jacob and Robin story show that they actually used freedom as a tool to encourage the good behavior of enslaved people without actually giving a real promise. So from those two stories, we can notice that multiple motivations are actually behind the delay of manumission. But also, as what I said previously, it is always important to know that the account provided in the deed is only the version of the stories provided by the slave owners. Next page, please.
Should I talk about this?
I think you're best.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a real really sort of crude representation of the geographic distribution of the some of the deeds that we looked at and that we've talked about today. So the bulk of the deeds that we found were in central Maryland, in the center of the Western Shore, so Montgomery, Prince George's, and Anne Arundel County, and those are the ones you can see toward the bottom. Harford County is further to the north, above Baltimore County, and that's where the Cox family that Lydia just discussed was based. And we think that this is approximately where those farms or plantations were located. This is also gives you a sense of sort of some of the additional work that we want to do with this project. And it will be very time consuming because in most of these deeds, in fact, in practically none of the deeds, we don't have information about where exactly where the people were located. But this just gives you a sense of where some of our deeds or some of the enslavers were based.
So I'm pretty sure that's our last slide. So I can leave us here so we can open up the conversation. And I also thought I could screen share the House of Hopkins blog at some point.
Oh, sure, that'd be great. Yeah, and let me just, before we open up for questions, say one additional thing about the Harford County deeds. Harford County is the only county in Maryland where there is an actual deed book that collects all of the manumissions. So it was this gift, Harford County, or whatever they were doing back in the late 18th century. It's been a gift to us because we only had to go to this one deed book. In every other county, as Hardy described, these manumission deeds are interspersed between numerous other types of deeds, mostly property deeds that were submitted during this time. So that's that. All right. I think we're open for questions. Don't be shy. I know it's Friday.
I think one question that might be good to start with is why did they have to manumit people at 18 and 21? Like what were those, where did those dates come from?
Yep. So actually, does somebody want to jump in and answer that? Otherwise, I will. Yeah, that was the Quaker norm. The Quaker norm was to release in women at the age of 18, men at the age of 21. What we see also with the Quaker manumissions, they tend to be more formulaic because a lot of Quakers actually used a printed form that they filled in the names and different information onto, and then those forms that were partly pre-printed were taken to the clerk for recording in these deed books. What's again interesting about those non-Quaker deeds, like the one that Lydia just spoke about, is that they don't follow that formulaic pattern. So a clue to us that we're looking at a Quaker deed is if it has that formula, and if you see women being released at 18 and men at 21, if it did not follow that particular pattern, it was a clue to us that we were looking at a non-Quaker manumission. And then it could be they could be released at any age, again, up to 50 in this period, only up to 50. They were only allowed to manumit enslaved individuals up to the age of 50. But that was one of the clues we looked at to know if we were getting Quaker or non-Quaker. I think, Professor Morgan, did you have a question?
I do. My question, so of the 2% of manumissions during your time period, what's your current best guess at the percent of that 2% that are Quaker manumissions?
So go ahead, Hardy.
I would say right now, I think our percentage that we have is somewhere in the 50s. It's somewhere between like 51 and 58. The problem is that it's a really imperfect figure because nowhere on the documents are people signing off as Quakers. kind of like what we just heard about. There's a couple standard practices, for example, manumitting at 18 and 21. A couple key phrases, for example, diverse good causes and considerations is one. You can pick up on these general terms and kind of get the idea that they're a Quaker. We also usually have records of Quaker meetings who we can check these individuals against. So most of the individuals who we know for fact right now are Quakers are individuals who we either recognized from the meetings minutes as prominent families, or we saw those key phrases in those manumissions, and then we kind of backtrack them and figure out their lineage as a Quaker.
And the phrases come from the
phrases are in the manumissions themselves.
Yeah, I
so
get that. But how did you know they were Quaker phrases?
Because I mean, for example, we didn't at first. At first, they were just things that we thought were common in all manumissions. But then very quickly, once we started realizing that known Quaker families, for example, the Hopkins, the Snowdens, Linthicums, whoever, were using these phrases and other people weren't. So for me personally, I think it was probably 6 months into my research really that I started realizing that for diverse causes and considerations is a great example of one. Diverse would usually be spelled without an E, D-I-V-E-R-S. And it would really pick up your eye. It was never a promising indicator that someone would be Quaker, but it's always grounds to go and check them against meetings. But it's a tough process, and it indicates how unstable kind of our metric for how many Quakers can be if you really press it.
Yeah, well, what's the what do you think the mechanism is that generates those Quaker phrases? Is it a common lawyer, or is it or is it something from some prior document that a meeting produced?
Yes, so it can be a bit of both, but the main reason that we see is that after this 1777, 1778 period where the meetings started asking their members to release their enslaved individuals, we found that those same meetings generally provided templates and a lot of structural help in helping that get done. So for example, in these meeting minutes and the recordings of what was going on, we see records of individuals having come in, having reported that they had freed their enslaved people or that they were planning to free their enslaved people. Oftentimes we see as witnesses on these documents the same couple people. I kind of personally theorize that there was a couple of these individuals who were officials within the meetings who were kind of bringing these documents with them. But one of the reasons, though, is that these people were often drafting these manumissions together.
Well, that's fascinating. That suggests that it's not just the consequence of a shift in beliefs in the Quaker community that led to the manumissions, but is also that they developed the capacity to do it and do it more efficiently. So
exactly,
that's an understudied angle. Interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
It is.
And I'll just add one thing to that, if you don't mind. The law of 1752 stipulated that deeds had to be witnessed. And so very often the witnesses were not other Quakers. They were other people at the county court that they would grab and bring in and say, hey, did you witness that this happened? One thing about manumission deeds that's unfortunate is that Quakers could not swear on any legal instrument, anything really, but for illegal instruments, they could not swear. Instead, in most cases, states allowed them to affirm that what they were saying or wanting to do was legitimate. But that's not the case with manumission deeds, because manumission deeds, you did not have to swear. So we don't have that language that you sometimes see in other documents where it's this is affirmed by so-and-so of the people called Quakers, which is why it's hard to get, it's sometimes hard to know whether we're dealing with a Quaker or not.
Also, you can also see it on the witness testimonials. They'll say signed and sworn by and witnessed by whoever. And so yeah, that's another good indicator of, oh, we might be looking at a Quaker versus not looking at a Quaker. But it's a very tough process to figure out sometimes.
Don?
Again, fantastic job presenting all this information that you have gathered. It's amazing. One question I had was, if that law was passed in 1752, did it stay in place all the way up through making slavery illegal in Maryland in the 64? Is that what it was? 63.
She has the answer.
She's shaking her head. Somewhere in the 1800s.
Yeah, so actually in the 1790 slide that the General Assembly actually repealed the 1752 law based on a petition submitted by Quakers. So it was until 17
Quakers. Okay.
yes, so until 1790 this law actually was repealed, and like now people are allowed it to have, you know, manumission by will. So yes, not
Okay.
until the very
So that
end of,
makes
you know.
your
It's-
makes your research much harder now because now you've got more sources of information for sure. And where do you see this going? I mean, what point do you think you'll be done, if ever?
I think so. It depends on the purpose. We started out just trying to understand the legacy of slavery inside of the Hopkins family and kind of what influenced that. Before we quickly realized that we had a much bigger opportunity on our hands because of the lack of information that's available to the public in terms of this community at this time period. And I think very quickly, with our map, we've realized that a lot of work needs to be done connecting these people to their descendants. And it's a very important, again, I think I mentioned earlier that these people's names are recorded very few times in history. Oftentimes they're just recorded as existing, but not as being named individuals or who their families are or where they lived. So these manumissions sometimes are the best indicators of that information. And we're hoping that we can start using these manumissions to connect families together, and then start linking them to people who live in Baltimore today. Would be our ideal hope. It would be a very complicated process involving very talented genealogists, but it also would be something that would be very rewarding just after learning so much about these individuals. But does anyone else want to talk about that too?
Any other questions? Oh, Chris, hi. You're muted.
And I just clicked it to unmute, so I must have done it the opposite way. So this is, yeah, great work. I'm really glad to see it. And I saw you guys the other day in the search room, and I really had no idea. I was like, oh, I wonder what they're working on, because just like from my view up in the second floor, I think, oh, they have books out and they're looking at this. Oh, it's Professor Morgan's group. That's what they're in. And then here you are at the presentation. Very well done. I really liked it a lot. So you've decided to focus on the Hopkins family because of that. Or along with that, you focused on Quakers. Is that right? Okay.
Yes.
Because what we have within the many years that we put together trying to search manumissions and certificates of freedom, as I'm sure you know, is that we only went through all the records that were already of that name. So we knew that these were certificates of freedom. We knew that they were manumissions. So what you've done is great, because these are the records that would have to be the deep dive to find out where people were manumitted or granted certificates of freedom within unnamed or more generic land records and or wills. So that's wonderful. One period I would like to suggest as a possibility, depending on your resources and your interests, would be the Revolutionary War. Because what I try to think in terms of is, are there periods of time from a historical perspective where matters of this type might have been taking place because for whatever reason. I mean, the Civil War itself, up until the abolition of slavery, November 1st, 1864 in Maryland, when people sense that slavery is running out of its viability and its profitability, will there be a lot of sales going on? Or let me just free these people because I don't want to have to take care of them after slavery is no longer something I can bound them by. And also within the friction and the tension and the hypocrisy of the Revolutionary War, would there be persons who would feel more of a mindset of, well, this is wrong and I should do this, or I should sell because I just still feel badly about this. And just in general, the difference between before the war and after the war, and some of those laws that you mentioned, 1790, and there's also, I think, a big influx of laws around 1791 about manumissions and freeing and how long you could stay in a certain county, that I'd be very interested to know within those 8 years if the activity of manumitting enslaved people rises, and if it does it rise in a particular area of the state more so than in others? Southern region, Eastern Shore, the crux, the center of the state, or the western part of the state, very close to Pennsylvania. Where do these things occur? Would be something that would be very interesting to us as well. So I'm just throwing that out there. But I'm very happy with what you've done.
That actually connects to something that we got to hear about yesterday from Dr. Ed Poppenfuss, who I'm sure you know. He'd gotten to come and he'd brought up how, so there's obviously a kind of a chronological distribution in terms of the amount of records that we find. We find different amounts in different years. Part of that just has to do with what records surviving and in what counties at what time and how many of them are available. But also there are really important political considerations to make. One that was brought up was the fact that the British were offering freedom to enslaved people who turncoated or who had joined the British side. And that could have affected both how many people pursued manumission and how many people were given it. There's also 1791, we were thinking about kind of the Haitian Revolution, and that really kind of comes into how we think about, for example, our Anthony case and his fight to pursue his own freedom in the courts, and how people would have seen that. How people would have seen free Black people in the wake of that Haitian Revolution would have been different.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a very political person, so I really like kind of trying to bring in what was happening in the world to what was happening in these people's lives and how they might have interacted. It's definitely a great thing to think about.
1791, 1793, there's certainly the years right around there, the laws just get they get stricter stricter in many ways.
They do. Yeah, I'll just add a couple and those are all terrific comments and questions. And yes, and it goes also to Don's question about sort of where do we take this project? I mean, we could take it ahead in time. We could take it back in time. We decided to focus on the Western Shore because that's where the Hopkins were based. Also, the Western Shore Quaker meetings all reported to Baltimore yearly meeting, whereas the Eastern Shore reported to Philadelphia. So slightly different, but there were a lot of Quaker manumissions that happened on the Eastern Shore. And that's like a whole other area that we could potentially study as well, and there are records that exist in many of those counties. So yeah, and then and as Hardy was mentioning, we also are interested in digging down into some of these individual stories and finding out more about these people that were mentioned in the deeds who really don't have a voice in this project. And that's, ultimately, I think where we want to get, just in this screen this image that you're seeing on the screen, you can see one person named Peter Powell. Peter Powell was manumitted by an enslaver who was a member of the Sandy Spring Quaker meeting. He is one of 19 individuals in our database that has a surname. So this is one of the really tricky, I mean, you know this really well, Chris. This is one of the really hard things about finding descendants of these individuals. We very rarely have surnames. Sometimes they had surnames and they weren't used, but a lot of times they didn't. So when we get something like this, Peter Powell, we can begin to try to make those connections. And one thing I'm really hoping that we can do is connect with some of the organizations around Sandy Spring meeting and the museums there, and also the free Black communities that were founded by many of these families that were manumitted in this period, and see if we can make those connections.
So I was thinking, do you want me to share the blog real quick? I haven't pulled
Sure.
up.
Yeah, we've got a few minutes left.
Bam.
Almost coming
While
up
she's
on
doing that,
Uh-huh.
Sydney, while he's pulling that up, have you guys ever looked into the Duvall family? They were at Marietta House in PG County. I know
Not much, no.
I pulled it up so I could get the name right. It's Gabriel was his name, and he was a lawyer who represented many manumission requests, and he had about a 75% success rate, even though he kept his own slaves.
Mhm.
There's part of that paradox you guys were talking
Right.
about, is like, how does this work? But he appears to have had a lot of records, and they're still there available at Marietta House. They've identified families with first and last names that he worked to get freed, plus the ones that were enslaved in the household. So
Right.
might be a good resource for you too.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, thank
Professor
you.
Van Morgan, do you want to give us a little background on what this
Oh
website?
yeah, so I mean, this is a blog I started really at the beginning of this process 2 years ago, and it was just a way actually for me to collect what the information that I was gathering, to write a little bit about some of the research that I was doing, but also once this project was joined with students, it's also been a place where some of the students that have been involved have also published certain. In fact, actually, can you click on the laws tab?
Laws.
This is a page, I call it a resource page, but this was a page that was constructed by Qingxi because we were running into this problem, exactly what Chris, you were just discussing, of what were the laws, when were they passed, how did they change, you know, the ages and all of these various specifics. And so we have connected, we've tried to include all of the relevant laws. In fact, if you go down, you'll see the law of 1752. And if you click on the law of 1752 that Qingxi talked about, it will actually take you to the Maryland State Archives text of the law. So you don't have to take our word for it, what the law did. You can go and read it yourself. But this has been very helpful, and it's the kind of work that we've done in addition. If you click on the manumissions tab, this is where we have yep, see, there you go. So you can go and you can read the laws. And I just want to give a shout out to the Maryland State Archives. I'm glad you saw us there the other day. We were there last week, digging into some of the other books and indexes, and all of the staff have been wonderful. Ed Poppenfuss has helped us a lot. He got us started really in the Maryland land rec system, which is not user-friendly. And so this is where we published posted a lot of the information that we've gathered, including the spreadsheet of the 527 names that we have gathered so far. When we get our next iteration, expansion of the data set, we will be posting that here as well. But you can go in, you can also check our work. So if you see something and you think maybe it's wrong, let us know. I did a little word cloud of the names of the individuals that were named in these deeds, and so you can see what was more popular. You know, mostly Anglo names, some biblical names, some classical names, that kind of thing. So, so there's a lot of information on this page that is in addition to, you know, what we presented today. Our map, yep, that yellow star there is, click on that, Johns Hopkins birthplace at Whitehall or White's Hall. Just below that, that dark, that's Linthicum Walks. Yay. Just south of where Johns Hopkins was born. And this is the Anne Arundel County Free School. And so something that by looking at this graphically, we can see the relationships between the families in and the different property owners and enslavers in this particular area. It's lore, family lore, that Johns Hopkins attended this school during his younger years. And to do that, he had to walk there, again, according to family lore, he would have walked right by Linthicum Walks. And we know that the Linthicums and the Hopkins were very closely entangled, even though the Linthicums were not Quaker. The purple, actually, you know, click on the dark, the black star.
I'd also add real quick, the Linthicums we just heard about testified in the Anthony case that I talked
They
about
did.
earlier.
Yeah,
The Hopkins family was suing each other over trying to free someone. The Linthicums were one of the only families to testify on behalf of Anthony, or on behalf of the side that would have been closer to Johns Hopkins. And it's interesting to maybe see that geographical factor that could have played into that.
Yeah, and just real quick, these here, Sacred Heart Catholic Church, the purple star and the brown star, those are the Jesuit properties. And I've added them that were, there were a lot of slaves that were based at these properties, and I've added them to this little map that I've started. Well, actually, that's Bel Air Mansion, that's another thing. But anyways, the blue and the purple, to show you just how close they were to these, this area where there were a lot of Quakers. The green star is Sam Snowden's property. And the So the Jesuits owned property on both sides of the Patuxent River. Some of you are familiar with the 272 individuals that were sold by the Jesuits in 1838 to fund Georgetown University. That was happening right next to the Hopkins farm. Many of those individuals were based at those properties that were called White Marsh. The Black Star is where the Indian Spring Quaker meeting was. This was the meeting that where both Sam Snowden and Johns Hopkins, they were both members there. So there's a lot of additional information. I encourage you to look at it. I think we're over. Any parting thoughts, questions?
See, my last parting thought would be to check out the essays tab. That's my favorite tab.
Oh yes, okay.
It starts off with one of my kind of favorite. What got me into this was Professor Van Morgan's essay. It was in response to the finding that Johns Hopkins had been reported in 1840 as owning slaves. And it was a very interesting essay contextualizing that finding. And then we have kind of built on that to kind of write these contextualizing essays on all of these different figures who we found with many different, very interesting stories if you like history. So I would check those out.
Okay. Thanks, Hardy.
That being said,
I think we'll end here. I want to thank all of you for being here, for the comments and questions. This was really helpful for us. I know I'm energized to continue with this research. And I especially want to thank these 3 students. I'm so proud of the work that you have done. So, all right. Take care, everyone.
thank you all so much for coming.
Bye. Good work.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.